Afternoon. Happy Friday. I gotta say it one more time. Welcome to our final session for the Shakespeare in Prisons Conference, the fourth International Shakespeare in Prisons Conference. Here we are. I'm gonna go ahead and hand it right over to Tom Mcgill, who's gonna help moderate a discussion with Phil Scraton today. We're so honored to have you all here today. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Scott. It's a great honor for me to be here and to be able to host Phil. I've known Phil since about 2007 when he first came to a screening of Mickey B. We just made the film that we made with prisoners in Mcgill prison, and Phil came to see it afterwards. And immediately, struck up a conversation with this man, and we've been friends ever since. He's one of the most generous men I've ever met in my life, and one of the busiest. Just in terms of his background, he's emeritus professor of law at Queen's University Belfast, held visiting profs in the US, Australia, and New Zealand, published widely on critical theory, incarceration, and children and young people. His publications are huge and include In the Arms of the Law, Coroner's Inquests and Deaths in Custody, Prisoners Under Protest, Childhood in Crisis, and Hillsborough the Truth. If you've never read Hillsborough the Truth, it's an incredible work. And also, Phil was a consultant on the documentary, the award-winning BAFTA winning documentary by Dan Gordon, 2017, called Hillsborough. Check that out. I mean, it's amazing, 28 years that man spent of his life, and still does, volunteering for people. And then, having refused the UK's Order of British Empire, he was awarded the Freedom of the City of Liverpool. So he refuses the OBE and takes the honour bestowed upon him by his native Liverpool. What characterizes Phil's work for me is it's always the view from below. In Antonio Gramsci's terms, Phil is an organic intellectual, speaking truth to power, always in the name of the oppressed. Phil Scraton.
Thank you so much, Tom. And I can only disappoint after all of that wonderful introduction. But thank you so much. And it is great to be introduced by Tom. The feeling is mutual. And I think that somebody who has himself given so much to not only the issues around prisons, but also in terms of the media, and by the media, I mean your media, and that whole process of developing a dialogue internationally around what has happened in prisons here, but bringing prisoners with him in doing that and giving them the confidence to act in Mickey B, for example. And I'm going to be mentioning that a little later. I think it'll come as no surprise to anybody who knows my work to know that I'm an abolitionist. I'm a prison abolitionist in the sense that I realize that we can't abandon prisons tomorrow because of the history of prisons and because of the history of incarceration. So it's not a mantra. It's not a simplistic mantra that we abolish prisons. It's that we have a gradual approach to the reduction of imprisonment, to their eventual removal. They're a blight on humanity. They always have been. I have evidence from 200 years ago when people were held in chains, where it wasn't just about humane prisons, it was about abolishing the concept of prisons. More about that in a second. Given the audience and given the conference, I just wanted to remind people of the Globe Theatre in London, which has been completely refurbished as the home, I suppose, of Shakespearean presentation. And the reason I'm showing that in a talk on prisons is because there is another globe, very similar. This is the globe that looks in, where the people on the outside look in to watch those who are gathered in the center. But the other globe is Bentham's panopticon, almost identical in shape historically, but here people are looked at. The view is from the center to watch those locked away and incarcerated, forgotten. And that to me was just such an irony to be talking on Shakespeare in prisons and then to think of the juxtaposition of two globes. And of course, we would have historically thought the panopticon had gone. There is Bentham's illustration in the top left of your screen. And there on the right is a US panopticon. And down at the bottom of your screen is the famous Strangeways Prison, which was the home of a major uprising in the early 90s. And that they were all built on that line. We thought those days had gone in terms of panopticon until we see one of the most recent built in the States again in the bottom right. The panopticon, I think, will always be with us. So that juxtaposition was a way of calming myself down in my introduction, but also introducing what I'm going to be talking about tonight. This is Oscar Wilde. The vilest deeds, like poison weeds, bloom well in prison air. It's only what is good in man that wastes and withers there. Pale anguish keeps the heavy gate, and the warder is despair. For they starve the little frightened child, till it weeps both night and day. And they scourge the weak and flog the fool, and gibe the old and grey. Each narrow cell in which we dwell is a foul and dark latrine, and all but lust is turned to dust in humanity's machine. He nearly died in prison, Oscar Wilde, and I think that the Ballad of Reading Gaol is perhaps one of the most incredible pieces of writing about imprisonment, and it has absolute relevance today. I insist, and I don't usually insist with my students, but I insist that they read it. Susan Sontag asks the question, when she's talking about how we view the suffering of others internationally, what to do with such knowledge of faraway suffering? It seems normal, she says, for people to ignore the ordeals of others. We don't get it. We truly can't imagine how dreadful, how terrifying, and how normal it becomes. Can't understand, can't imagine the suffering of others. Others. That reminded me of the book I bought just after I'd left university, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex. She had a walk-on part in my degree as Jean-Paul Sartre's partner. That was the only mention of her in the entire social philosophy program that I studied. And then I discovered The Second Sex. And it opened a whole world of analysis. Others, she says, and she talks about woman as being defined and differentiated with reference to man. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. She is the other. And that's a very oft used quote these days. It wasn't when I read it. It made absolute sense. It made sense in terms of my mother, in terms of my sister, in terms of the women in working class Liverpool, where I'm from. But then you turn the page. And on the following page, Simone de Beauvoir doesn't forget Blacks in the USA, the indigenous in the colonies, which I would also include Ireland, proletarians within capitalist economies. The whole concept and notion of other is central to what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And then I was thinking about Paulo Freire, the notion of conscientization. What does it mean? What is he getting at in terms of us understanding the principles and processes with which we're concerned? There are three key strands: developing and progressing a critical analysis of socio-economic, political context, and the structural inequalities that surround us. Identifying the lived realities, the dynamics of exclusion, as I would put it, and mobilizing the strengths of the collective. We tonight are that collective. That's who we are. That's how we identify. And our role is to challenge oppression, resist injustice, and the politics is politics of direct action. Not necessarily the politics of direct action that kicks down the door, but the politics of direct action that at least approaches the door, stands at the door, and demands that the door be opened. And I wanted early on in this talk to acknowledge the work of Tom Mcgill and the Education Shakespeare Company. I didn't want to talk too much about it, but I do want people to assure me that they are going to root out a copy of Mickey B. It's a remarkable film. It's made in a prison with prisoners who those who run the prison told Tom are too dangerous to work with. These are lifers. These are dangerous men. But also, they're no-hopers. They've got no life. They've got no future. And I defy anybody to watch Mickey B and hold with that position. Because what you see in Mickey B is not only amateur actors performing excellent versions of it, of what is a brilliantly written piece. Of course, Mickey B is Macbeth. It's Shakespeare, but it's Shakespeare inside. And listen to Sam McLean, one of those who was so moved and so involved with Mickey B. What did he say about it? He said, it's the most important thing I've ever done. Jail brutalizes. You feel hopeless. This project meant something to everyone inside, whether they were acting, whether they were putting together the scenery, whether they were running around, sorting stuff out, making tea. The project meant something to everyone inside. And that's really what I want to talk about when reflecting on what my work is this evening. Those who know me know that, and Tom's already mentioned it, that what concerns me is not the view from above. We are the view from above. I work in a university. I have credibility. I'm involved. I'm invited onto television, onto radio. And I can make use of that, yes. But the real view, the view that I'm concerned of, is the view from below. My role as a social analyst, as a sociologist, but also as a human being, is to bear witness. I try to teach my students, we all must have an inquiring mind. We gather testimonies. We don't just write our books for our books and academic journal articles for ourselves. We should be basing them on the lived experiences of those around us, their personal troubles. Because as C. Wright Mills said, it's their personal troubles that are public issues. That should be our concern. The relationship between that which is troubling personally and that which is an issue for our social existence. But in doing this, the main objective is to recover truth. And I know some people listening will say, truth is relative. It's a philosophical rather than a clear concept. No. When that door slams shut in a jail and isn't opened for another 14 hours, and you have to go to the toilet in a small cardboard potty in the corner, and you're sharing a cell with another person in a bunk bed, don't talk to me about the relativity of truth. That is real. That is lived. That is truth. And it's a truth that the majority of people don't know. That's why our role in developing the view from below is to build alternative accounts. Why? Because official discourse is a deceit. Whether it's published in newspapers, on television, online, wherever it comes from, official discourse is always a deceit. And I don't mean Trump. Of course, Trump was deceitful. You couldn't miss his deceit. I'm talking about the deceit of politics more broadly. Prison. Prison is a total institution. It's one of the few total institutions that we come across in our lives. It is completely closed. You're only allowed in with permission unless you're a prisoner or you work there. It's total. It's all consuming. It's an island. In actual fact, because there are multiple prisons, it's an archipelago. And those buses or minibuses or transport that goes between them are the umbilical cord between prisons and between court and the prison. That's not just symbol, that's reality. I've been banned out of enough prisons over the years to know that whatever my status, it means nothing if the prison governor decides not to let me through the fence and into the prison. And what are we doing in terms of the view from inside the prison, the view from below? The wonderful sociologist and writer Richard Quinney, I think, said it better than I could ever say it. Separating people through the institution of the prison creates population of wounded lives inside the prison or outside the prison. This is the dance of the slave and slaveholder, the inmate and captor, prisoner and non-prisoner. No one escapes the damage caused by the fact that prison exists. It is pervasive, economic, social, psychological, and spiritual. The injuries caused by prison are shared by us all. And I don't just mean families who are impacted by prisons because one of their loved ones is in prison. I'm talking about all of us, everyone watching tonight, everyone hearing this is affected by the pains of confinement. As I put it, they're inflicted not in somebody else's name, they're inflicted in our name. They're financed by the public purse. But beyond economic costs, there are more profound consequences. These consequences are social, they're political, but also fundamentally, they're emotional. And for us to really understand that, I want to go back to the wonderful US sociologist Irving Goffman. Remarkable. His book Asylum has every bit of relevance today as it did at the time. He would, if he was writing today, not simply use the word he, I'm sure, but that would be one of my only criticisms. The prisoner begins a series of abasements, degradations, humiliations, and profanations of self. The barrier that total institutions placed between the prisoner and the wider world marks the first curtailment of self. When I first read that, I think I was about 19. I hadn't been in a prison at that point. And I thought, curtailment of self. What a concept, what a notion, what an idea, what a reality. And as I wrote in Prisons Under Protest with my colleagues Joe Sim and Paula Skidmore, after we had been researching in one of the worst prisons in Scotland, in Peterhead, the totality of the institution in terms of its political and professional autonomy is underwritten by a degree of totality or absolutism in power relations, which virtually strip the prisoner of civil rights, personal consultation, and democratic process. The prisoner is literally a lost soul. Some of you will be aware of this photograph. 60 Minutes program in the United States showed the left-hand photograph. This is regarding, as Susan Sontag would put it, the pain of others, wired up to electrodes. And when I first saw that, it spoke for itself until I saw the second photograph. The first photograph had been cropped. What gets to me about the second photograph is the casualness of a GI on his phone, just standing there, not affected. So lost is his humanity that he cannot even begin to see that if that guy moves, he gets an electric shock. He doesn't care. It's ambivalence. I'm not talking about that one GI or those who were held responsible afterwards, the small group. I'm talking about a whole network, a whole army, a whole military, a whole government that actually allows that to happen internationally, not just the USA, but internationally. Susan Sontag also says perhaps the only people with the right to look at images of suffering of this extreme order, and she's not talking about this, she's talking about famine. But images of suffering of this extreme order are those who could do something to alleviate it. Yes. So I look at that and I can't help that guy who's being tortured. But I can do something to alleviate it. I can do something to challenge, to oppose the dynamic that creates that inhumanity. As I said in a piece written with Linda Moore on women in prison here in the north of Ireland, our work is about asserting the right to know. It is investigative and it's revelatory. It bridges the inside-outside physical divide by informing the outside of what happens on the inside. It achieves from the view from below, the view traditionally of the underclass, by the view from within. Reporting, recording, interpreting mind-numbing routines, as well as the harsh punishments and occasional cruelties, form the process of engagement with the prison as a total institution, bearing witness to the humiliation and lack of self-determination normalized in the lives of the incarcerated. And I came across a book written just as I was born, actually, by Barnes and Teeters in the United States. And this shows absolutely clearly how there has been a consistent movement, not just with critical resistance in the contemporary period in Oakland, but historically. Many who know prison cruelty attribute it to the deliberate viciousness and sadism of wardens, keepers, and guards, but it is the institutional and routine aspects of prison administration and life, rather than the arbitrary personal sadism and depravity, which accounts for the most cruelty and personal demoralization that goes on in our prisons. Imprisonment, they say, supplies the method of carrying out the revengeful spirit of an outraged society. Lock them up, throw away the key. Bringing satisfaction for the wrongs, real or alleged, that are brought upon it by the offender resulting in the release of cruel impulses by guards inured to their sadistic actions. Why? Because the prisoner is other. As Nelson Mandela says, prison is designed to break one's spirit and to destroy one's resolve. To do this is the authorities attempt to exploit every weakness, demolish every initiative, negate all signs of individuality, all with the idea of stamping out that spark that makes each of us human and each of us who we are. Talk to any prisoner, talk to any former prisoner. They might not put it as eloquently as Nelson Mandela, but they will give you the same message. Stamping out that spark that makes each of us human and each of us who we are. The prisoner, in Simone de Beauvoir's terms, is other. So, with this in mind, when I was 23 and only knew the prison in Liverpool, Walton Prison, from the outside, long hair, standard beard, right to work badge, waistcoat, collarless shirt, jeans. I rocked up at the prison to teach a class of, believe it or not, on criminology. See the irony in that? I waited half an hour until after the class should have started before they let me in. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I was part of the team that analyzed the Peterhead uprising. People call it a riot. I never call what happens in prisons when prisons take over, Attica, for example. It's not a riot, it's an uprising. Strangeways. While I was writing the book on Peterhead, Strangeways uprising. The Barlinnie Special Unit in Scotland, where those who were considered to be the worst of the worst were held in an experimental prison within a prison. In fact, it was incredibly humane. And I spent time there, met T.C. Campbell, who was threatened, oh, when you come back out of here and you go to Shot, the maximum security prison, for the last 2 years of your sentence, then you're going to suffer. T.C. Campbell, who was innocent of the crime that he'd been committed for. Witnessing deaths in custody, I'm found a member of Inquest in 1980 to support families whose loved ones have died in custody. Then here in Northern Ireland, Morn House, the women's prison to Hydebank Wood, and then to the main prison here, Maghaberry. Working in the States with Inside Out and with the Journal on Prisons by Prisoners. All of this tells me one thing for sure. Prisons are human zoos. I remember standing in the desert in Australia, a prison in the desert. And I was talking to T.C. Campbell, who was doing life. I was talking to him in a cage no bigger than the room I'm sitting in, which was his exercise area. He was in isolation. He had a ZZ Top beard right down low. And he could sing as well. But he was an intellectual, a public intellectual. I'm now very honored to have been his external examiner for his PhD. But that's not the story. He said to me, I was in this cage one day and that door over there opened, and into this big yard came a group of students with their tutor. And they approached. I was talking, he said, to a priest, and they approached. And as they approached, the tutor ran round in front of them and put his arms out to protect them. T.C. Campbell said two things. He said, what the fuck do you think I'm going to do? I'm in a cage. And the second thing he said was how dare you impose yourselves on my conversation? Those two acts, so for me, summarize all that experience of researching within walls. That day when I was going into Walton Prison in Liverpool in my collarless shirt and my beard and all the rest of it, this is what I wrote about it. They kept me at the gate for half an hour, knowing the guys would be waiting in class, losing precious out-of-cell time. As escorted through the bowels of the Victorian prison, I retched at the acrid stench of sewage, unwashed bodies, and half-eaten dinners. A step ahead, the guards embarked on a tirade of abuse and intimidation. It was aimed at me. Who the fuck does he think he is, coming here from some college? Like they give a shit. They'll have him, Nancy boy. Showing me into a dilapidated classroom without comment, they left. The key turned in the lock. The anger in the room at the delay and the deliberate failure to unlock fellow prisoners was immediate. This was my induction to prison, and it was complete. These were men who were locked up to a cell, who used to wrap their feces in newspaper and drop it out of the window because of the stench. And in the morning, a guy would go around with a one-wheel wheelbarrow and shovel it up. They called it the shit detail. That was my first impression of a prison. Now I know that the prison estate here in Ireland, in England, in Scotland, anywhere that I know, Australia, New Zealand, the USA, is not fit for purpose. The management and staff are not trained for purpose. There is non-engagement with prisoners. They are seen as the enemy, or if there is a close proximity, then those who administer to them are seen as being over-familiar with prisoners. Obstructive work practices and poor industrial relations predominate. There's a culture of impunity and denial. How many times have I seen a prisoner hospitalized at the hands of guards and then the prisoner taking the blame and the responsibility for the fight that ensued? Right down to guards punching each other to bring up a bruise to show that they'd been assaulted. Reaction rather than proaction. Inadequate mental health care, visits, family contact, minimal out-of-cell time, lack of constructive activities, failures in oversight. They're our prisons, yet we have no oversight, and failures in monitoring. And of course, across the States and in many other countries, that long wait for the death penalty. I was in Mournehouse Women's Prison here, not long after I moved to the north of Ireland, when Annie Kelly had just taken her own life. At the end of the day, I know that if anything happens to me, there'll be an investigation. I never ripped the mattress, that's what she'd been accused of, or blanket, nor did I block the spy. If I take pneumonia, of course pneumonia, this is her letter, it'll all come out. I think you can only last 10 or 12 days without drinking, because then you dehydrate and your kidneys go. I've no intention of eating or drinking again. So they're beat there. I know they'd all love me dead, but I'll make sure everything is revealed first. She died, it wasn't. For myself and my colleague Linda Moore did reveal her life and her death. This was a young woman who was first imprisoned at 15. She had never been in prison for a serious offense, but she'd been in multiple times. This was the last place she should have been. She was in desperate need of mental health support. Three years later, I was working in Hyde Bank Wood Women's Prison on my research when there were 2 code blues on one night. The women's prison by this time had moved to the male young offenders institution on the same site. One of the code blues was for Frances Mcgill. This was the last entry in her diary, which I'm using with permission of her family. Today has been an okay week and day, except this evening the voices are getting really bad. She's talking about the voices in her head. I can't put up with them much more. There was a code blue tonight on the wee lads in Elm. Code blue is when someone has hung themselves and died. So, she means so, we are locked all night. If these voices keep up, there will be another code blue tonight. I already have a noose made and ready, but I can't do anything until the night staff do the alarms. Then I have an hour. I've got it planned, and tonight is the night. And tonight was the night. And having waited for 6 months for a mental health referral, she took her own life. These are not voices from below or voices from within. These are silenced voices. Annie Kelly, Roseanne Irvine, Frances McGill, and now Ciara McCulloch, who I met and knew well in prison. It's worse, she said in the night. I hear voices and see things. They tell me to cut myself, and I release the pain as well. I try to hang myself. No one helps me. I've had no counseling since I've been in here. She was in a canvas pinafore dress, held together with sellotape because she would scour her arms on the Velcro. She went to a toilet in a potty in the corner. She was out of herself for 1 hour a day to walk the corridor. She was 18 years old at the time. There wasn't a bit of the flesh that I could see that wasn't cut or torn. From her shoulders to her hands, from her thighs to her feet. She came out of prison, and I knew her well. And 2 years ago, still very young, still hadn't made 30, cancer took her life. So the work that we were doing in terms of the gendered issue, it's important to make this distinction because criminal justice is heteronormative, whether it's in policing, courts, sentencing, sanctions, incarceration. In prisons and detention, the policies, the regimes, the culture, the punishment, the medicalization are all gendered. And that continuum of gendered violence and violation, and many of the women in prison have suffered gendered violence and violation in their lives at the hands of men that they know, carries on in terms of them being expected to behave differently, their identity, to dress differently, to appear differently, their physicality, their subjugation, even down to they must not swear. Whereas if you go in a men's prison, it is a string of expletives. But also significantly in terms of the major issue, as we all know, in terms of our society, or if we don't know, we should know, the politics of reproduction are defining. They don't necessarily, should not necessarily be totally inhibiting, but they're defining. Motherhood, menstruation, menopause, bodily integrity are all part of gendered relations. But in prison, they become part of the punishment, part of the exploitation of women, and the reverse, part of the exploitation of men in terms of male violence. But it moves beyond the walls. The amount of prisoners that I've worked with whose local neighbors don't know that they were in prison when they were away from home because they feel ashamed. They feel that they will be condemned. So there is a virtual, for every single prisoner, there is a virtual prison. within the family, within their individual lives, their social experiences, their economic circumstances significantly, within the community and in terms of interpersonal and institutional relationships, but also, and most dramatically, in the media, particularly these days in terms of social networks. All that has to be negotiated. All that has to be negotiated. The majority of the negotiators are women as partners and wives and daughters and mothers, attempting to maintain contact, experiencing the strip search themselves or the body search themselves of the visit, the stigma, the humiliation and the shame. When every one of us knows, there but for the grace it could have been me. I know that. I know that. Some of my friends from school, some of my friends at university, they went to prison, but particularly from school. I come from a working class background. It could have been me. And then, of course, negotiating the prison reality in terms of release, than the stigma of release, transitioning back into society, and gaining or trying to find support from others at a time when in the majority of working class communities, there is not even sufficient support for those who are consistently in the community. So all of this, for me, adds up to the great lie. The great lie is penal reformism. The World Health Organization talks about the healthy prison. I remember the first time I saw that. I was apoplectic. I couldn't control myself. What? A healthy prison? You couldn't have a more obvious oxymoron. How can a prison possibly be healthy? Oh, well, we have 4 criteria, you see. The 4 criteria for a healthy prison in the World Health Organization's knowledge base is safety. You must have safe environments in prisons. Respect. We must respect each other in prisons. That extends to guards. Purposeful activity. Oh, yes. We don't sew mailbags anymore, but maybe you can put all these tins in these boxes if you're lucky enough to get a job in a prison. 50% of our long-term prisoners here have no purposeful work at all. Oh, and then, of course, we put a little package together for your resettlement back into the community. Resettlement back to what? Now, not only are you unemployed, but you're unemployed with a criminal record. You're a former prisoner. And then the reformists use what I call the deceit of the 3 R's. We rehabilitate, we resettle, we reintegrate. Yes. Yes. What percentage? What mitigates against that? Those who so-called rehabilitate, resettle, and reintegrate do so despite the system, with the support of others, rather than because of it. Why? Because the whole system and process is controlling at every level. Oh, I was reading an academic research paper the other day, written by 3 academics from Oxford University. Do you know, and I look at it and I think, how did they get in the prison to do the research? Who was paying for it? Oh, it was the Home Office, the British government. That issue of how academic research and how contributing agencies that go into prison are managed is crucial to the extension of punitivity that exists across our prisons, whatever state we're talking about. It's control because we take the most vulnerable, those with the least to lose, and we isolate them and we punish them. And what the system has been brilliant at doing is to resist any form of effective monitoring and any form of accountability. This is the promise of penal reformism from the World Health Organization right the way through to local operation of prisons. Because penal reformism is about the politics of incorporation. With Jude McCulloch, who works in Australia, in one of the books that we put together, we talk about an alternative. For abolitionists, contemporary reformism, however well-intentioned, facilitates a politics of incorporation in which places of detention become rights compliant. Oh, we have a rights charter, it's up on the wall. Their managers and staff gain rights management and protection diplomas. In my university, they do. Not that I would ever teach on such a course. And independent monitors from the community annually report their visits and inspections over tea and biscuits. That perhaps is a little bit too cynical. But what isn't cynical is that the violence of incarceration is historically, socially, and culturally imprinted on the foundations of the prison. It can only be a violent place because it takes your liberty and it puts you in a cell and it locks you away. It is moderated or hidden beneath the veneer of mission statements, glossy brochures, and internet virtual tours. When you come off tonight, have a look at some of the prison virtual tours. Oh, I wouldn't mind actually spending some time in there myself. I maybe get some writing done. How cynical. So, if I am somebody who wants to see the abolitionist perspective move forward, we have to start with decarceration. We have to start with minimizing the use of prisons. And we start at the most obvious place, which is those who are going in for the shortest possible sentences. Why should I say this when Angela Davis, now a good friend of mine, has made this case strongly herself? The major challenge, she says, yes, prisons as last resort. Humane, habitable environments must be created. We can't have people living in the conditions I've been describing. But that mustn't bolster the permanence of the prison system. In other words, you provide better conditions. Oh, well, now prisons are okay. No, they are not. Justice system, she argues, should be based on reparation and reconciliation rather than retribution and vengeance. But most significantly, she calls for a constellation of alternative strategies, revitalization of community-based education at all levels. In the States, universal free physical and mental health care. It is free in our society, but it is insufficient, particularly mental health care, and particularly here in the north of Ireland. So this is the major challenge. And this takes us towards penal abolition. We can't abolish prisons today, tomorrow, next week. But what we can do, is to begin to work around the context which creates the prison as an inevitability, to end poverty, to secure essential services for all, to have inclusive, active participation of all community voices, to celebrate diversity and to defeat discrimination, to challenge fear, to create hope. It sounds so trite to say the word hope, but it's such an important word in all of our lives. To create hope through material opportunity, to promote critical thought and action through dialogue. Most significantly is the broader context to secure economic, social, and cultural rights. As I wrote with Dina Hayden, my partner, the struggle for rights and justice requires a fundamental shift in structural relations and the determining context of power, which marginalize and exclude from effective participation. I want to come to an end by saying that we can't separate prisons as being something outside of our remit, outside of our experience, because the personal is always political. We have to first respect the uniqueness of incarcerated lives. I don't mean hug a prisoner. What I mean is respecting those who are inside prison. We have to ensure that the view from inside is heard. We have to value difference rather than condemn it. And that enables us to strengthen resistance. And I draw on the French philosopher Frigga Haag to say, German philosopher, sorry, Frigga Haag to say that we must encourage memory work. And by that, we must not lose the identity of that which we already know. So we must encourage memory work. But more significantly, we have limited agency. I don't like the word structure and agency, but we, not prisoners, we have agency. We make choices. We can be agents of conflict, but most significantly, we can be agents of change. That is our lot as prison researchers.
Phil, thank you so much. That was just remarkable and inspiring and such a challenge. And it's something that everybody knows that it's true. And, you know, for people who've been on behind the door, it's even more true. And it's wonderful as somebody who has been behind the door to hear you speak about it. And Phil, you talked about hope, and prisoners need hope. We need to know that there are people there who care about people, you know, on the wrong side of the law. So it's just so encouraging, Phil, to hear you speak about it and to talk about it in such compelling terms, and in terms that are unarguable. You know, it's just like when you hear that argument, how long? I tell you what it is, Phil. I remember looking on a wall in Belfast, smashed the H blocks, and I remember looking at that on a wall, and as somebody who had been inside the Maze, you know, seen the Maze prison, not as a prisoner, but as a drama facilitator, and I thought, God, that's never going to happen. How can you possibly smash the H blocks? And it used to appear everywhere, smash the H blocks. And then 20 years later, suddenly the H blocks are no more. Suddenly those prisons are gone. They're demolished. There's one hospital wing left, and that's it. And it's gone. And I often think about that, and I think about it. Just takes a vision and courage and hope and a group of people who work together to make things happen. So, you know, thank you for inspiring us, Phil. And change is possible. Once upon a time, the H blocks were there, solid and, you know, impassable, and now they're gone. They're dust.
Melinda wanted to know what's giving you some hope right now, speaking of hope, in regards to abolition.
Yeah, I think Melinda, that's a really, it's a question I ask myself very regularly. Where does hope come from? I think that I am a believer in change. I do believe that there are ways in, that the only hope that I can actually have is to generate the stories that demonstrate the inhumanity that I've been talking about. But even at a lower level, one of the things that I am hopeful about is that some of those who are responsible for sentencing, I've noticed in the last 12 months, and possibly this is down to COVID, but they've been less eager to send people to prison for smaller, lower sentences. The vast majority of our prisoners are in prison for less than 2 years, 3 years, and the vast majority of them are on a revolving door. They're in and out, because there's no hope in the community. It's only when you see initiatives, as in Scotland, where in Glasgow and in Edinburgh, where there are alternative structures for dealing with drugs, dealing with alcohol, that you can see that you're making some inroad into keeping people out of prison. So on those two counts, especially, I think that it's a great irony, isn't it? And one of the things that really concerns me about this is that there I am campaigning for lesser sentences. There I am arguing of doing away with sentences. And at the same time, I'm having to accept the fact that during the pandemic, there has been a marked increase in violence against women. And there is no appropriate process for dealing with those men. And I think that therefore, you almost find yourself on that knife edge of saying, well, I'm a prison abolitionist, except in certain circumstances. And that process is all part of the working through to the next phase. All I can do, and I don't think I'm offering very much in doing this, but all I can do is to demonstrate, not just through talks, but to demonstrate through my work, the inhumanity of prison, and to support those initiatives that bring a more humanitarian approach to what happens in prison. So, for example, those who go in as artists in residence, or those who go in and refuse to be incorporated into the prison. They go in as writers, they go in as dramatists, they go into the prison to do that work. I know for a fact, there isn't any question, and Tom is the living evidence of this, that if you go into a prison and you give people respect and you develop ideas that are creative and you work together collectively, often against the wishes of the prison guards, but you do that, and if you have the opportunity to do that, you transform lives. Now, my objective would be for those lives to be transformed outside the prison. And again, I'm going to mention Tom and Kirsten and the work that they do around mental health. I'm absolutely convinced that when that kind of creative approach in the community to issues around mental health, issues around poverty, issues around violence, when they are addressed in a way that develops hope, I know it can't put food on the table, but it can give people a pride in their own identity. It can lift people. It can say that they are worth something. So I do think that the arts can make a major contribution, and have made a major contribution to keeping people out of prison, working with people who've been in prison, as well as working in prison with prisoners. And I think that's where the real effort, I think, needs. And what really, I suppose, I get very passionate about these things, obviously, but what really galls me is it costs a fraction of the cost of putting somebody in prison. A fraction. We're talking about people in prison for a year costing around £45,000 a year. If they're in maximum security, we're talking about 50 or 60,000. That's not very much different in dollars either. And so, you know, what we're taught, and they're being kept in really awful conditions, and the guards who are just simply guards are being paid crap wages. So, you know, if you could reinvest, you know, this is one of the big hobby horses I have, which is justice reinvestment. If you can reinvest that kind of money into community-based projects. In my earlier days, I was a very serious mountaineer and kayaker, and now my bones are beginning to bear the scars. But I worked voluntarily quite a lot with young guys and young women, but mainly with young guys, because they are the majority, who are on probation, and they'd been given an alternative of either going to prison or following a program. And they followed the program with some incredibly committed people that they had to attend all full time. And I would do outdoor activities with them. I mean, it was crazy because they were all hard lads and they are really tough, you know, really tough. And they just had to go at you all the time. And I'll be very quick. I remember one day coming down off a mountain in Bethgelert in North Wales, and there's this big iron bridge high above the river, and it's summer, so the river's low. And they all dived in, either head first or feet first, into the river, 20 feet below. And I tried to stop them, but they were just that tough, yeah? Fortunately, no one got hurt. And the reason I'm telling that story is because at 12 midnight that night, sitting with them in their accommodation, talking over cups of tea, 3 of them broke down. 3 of them cried about the lives that they were living. These hard, tough men, young men, who would do anything up there on the bridge, were now showing the real brokenness of their lives. I've never forgotten that. In fact, I think I got more out of that experience than they did. It was privileged to see that and to hear that. And I think that's the issue. So of course, I teach a module, gender, sexuality, and violence. So I get the issues around gendered violence. But I could also see gendered weakness, masculine weakness in them, which was not weakness, it was humanity for themselves. And there is hope. There is hope if those sorts of projects can plumb into that and support. But those guys would go back to their communities and they'd say, where have you been? Oh, you've been on holiday. You've had a great time. Call that a prison sentence. You know, that's the issue. We've got to break that mentality of suffering and hurt and pain as a payment for the wrong that people have done.
Well, I guess open hearts, open minds. We've been grappling a little bit about what is our role in all this, and I think you touched upon it already, Phil. I mean, one of the things I guess arts organizations is contributing by changing the narrative, hashtag more than a number. But you also said, you said something about going inside without becoming a cog in the wheel. But I oftentimes feel that all the rules and regulations we abide by make me also a part of the problem. So yeah, maybe this question is a little, but the question I wrote was, what is the role of prison arts organization in this system of oppression? And so I know it's a bigger question that maybe everyone could write something on and send it to me. But anyway, I'll shut up. And if you could speak to that, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll do it very quickly. Carla, imagine the prison and what you do in that prison without you. That's the starting point for me. If you take you out and you take your organization out, what is there left? So yes, you're negotiating the rules. Yes, you're having to do your best to sometimes bite your tongue, sometimes hold back. And I guess you would probably be a forthright woman. So in that situation, I guess that that's difficult for you. But that isn't a compromise. That is a facilitation of the work that you do. And it sounds trite to say it, but I actually mean it. The primary role of any organization that is progressive, but prison arts especially, the primary role, I believe, is to give people a sense of their own identity. That's the most important issue. If somebody who you are working with in whatever it is you're doing, whether it's drama or it's art or it's writing, if in that situation a person is developing a sense of their own identity that is their identity, it's not imposed by a teacher or a prison guard or anybody else. It comes from themselves because, and again, it sounds trite to say it, you have lit a spark. If you light a spark in the life of somebody who's had little hope, even if that spark doesn't generate a fire, but just stays a flickering flame, it's a flickering flame that would not be there in any other circumstance. I had the privilege of working when I was over at Amherst. I had the privilege of working on their Inside Out class, and I stood at the door. We went into the classroom. There were 10 students, myself, and the wonderful Kristin Boomiller, who's professor at Amherst, who facilitates the program. And I stood at the door as the prisoners came in. They were all coming towards the end of life sentences. They were all what you would describe as tough guys, and they were 90% black guys. And as they walked in through the door, I shook them a hand, each one of them, and introduced myself. Then we sat down, and they sat prisoner, student, prisoner, student, prisoner, student, in a circle. And I said, right, for the first half hour, I don't want any of the Amherst students to talk. I just want to hear from you guys. My mailbox when I came home after that was incredible. Why? Not just because of the class. They were seeing those students every week. Two things. One, that I touched them. Before I started, I touched them. I shook their hand. I showed them mutual respect. The second issue was that I asked the students to stay silent. And that wasn't tokenistic. That was because I wanted to make it clear to those guys that I wasn't some professor coming in with all the stereotypical notions of I'm here to teach this class and you will listen. I'm on your turf, your territory. You've been living here for years. And so I know that when I went, some of those prisoners will have been given a hard time by some of the guards because of the way it panned out. In fact, one of the guys never even got unlocked that day. And I know that the discretion the guards will impose will, to a certain extent, mitigate what I did. But I would hope that they will never forget the fact that not just myself, but Kristin and also the students, going back each week, were showing them respect as people. And I think that whatever that Whatever that prison does on a day-by-day basis, I can't deal with. I can't affect it, but I can affect it while I'm there. And I can show that humanity is not lost for them. Not because I'm some saint or I'm some great person, but just because I am a person who is prepared to engage in a dialogue that is on its own merits equal. Of course, it's not equal. Of course, I go out and I'm free. But it's a dialogue in that moment where either of us have, have real equality in the dialogue. And I think that to me is really important. So it's a long way round of saying that I'm an absolute firmly committed to the work that people like yourself do, because that is the spark of humanity that wouldn't otherwise be there. What would it be like if you didn't go in? And you beat yourself up because you come out and you think, I'm not making a difference. What good is this? Am I building up hope? Am I developing ideas that can't be realized? No. It's that spark of humanity that is so absent in a prison that you show. That's why I'm sitting here talking, really, because I'm privileged to be with people who would have that commitment.
Thank you so much for that. So much for us to take away from that. And I know that so many of us are in that conflict zone of, am I perpetuating harm, by continuing these programs? And that's just such a beautiful way to look at it. I think that is where we have to close the Q&A right now. But I want to turn it over to Kurt now, as we just kind of offer some reflections on these past 5 months that we've been meeting on these Fridays. It's kind of unbelievable. Kurt?
Well, it's hard to follow Phil. My reflection on the conference this year is filled with hope. It's been a very difficult year for all of us that were kicked out of the prisons and are still out for the most part. So it started hopeless, or feeling hopeless or helpless, but it hasn't ended that way. And a lot of it has had to do with our guests who've come and shared the deepest part of themselves. And in sharing the deepest part, I'll speak in the eye. I've been deeply touched by that, and I love Phil's expectation that he's going to live forever. I'm supportive of that he's not giving up, because I think for those of us that have been doing this a long time, the hope that's come out of this is the young people that are in these little boxes. Because I'm not going to live forever. The work is still incredibly important. There's more than enough of it to be done. And so I feel quite strongly that that's going to happen with the inspiration of the youth that are here. And it's always wonderful to hear the stories of the old timers, right? We're the elders, right, Phil? And Tom. And there's a place for the elders. The OGs inside. There's so much about the culture inside that is really beautiful and really unique. But the status of the elders and being able to tap into them, and then watching the elders touch the young people, guys that I've worked with that have long sentences and are not fathers, have lost their parents, have lost their siblings, But they see that bigger picture and reach out to those youth, and the youth are just starving for it, absolutely starving for it. And I'm an anarchist on the inside. But the anarchy that I try to sow is to break down the status quo, or the way that the outside world views the inside world. And the proliferation over the last 25 years of the stuff the programming that's going on in prison is I think, unequaled at any part of our history. There's just so much investment from academia getting into it, also in the Inside Out program. I mean, they're just marvelous programs. And so that's what I'm optimistic about. And I think I'll have to have some supplements. So for those of you that have an idea of a panelist or a panel or somebody that we as a community should know about their work, we've figured out, I should say, Scott has figured out how to do this quite efficiently, and build what is now the largest library. That's something, but the library shouldn't stop being filled. So,
thanks, Kurt. It's true. I think we have, at the end of this, we've created 42 sessions, each at least an hour. So it's about 55, maybe 60 hours of content, exploring all different facets, from pedagogical approaches to abolition, to anti-racism, to just this current moment with COVID and racial justice, that these things that should be at the center of our praxis, right? But we have created the world's, I believe, largest digital library of prison theater discussion, which is kind of amazing. Precious, are you there, Precious? Do you want to offer a reflection? Precious Wilson-Gay, who is part of our planning committee. I don't know if she's in there or not.
I am. I'm sitting here listening, and getting slightly emotional listening to Kurt talk, just because Kurt was my first introduction really into understanding what it is to do a prison arts program. And so just to hear him kind of reflect on the OGs and the youth, and kind of knowing that he's subliminally talking to me. I really appreciate that. I think that, when we began having these conversations this summer, there was a lot of dialogue. And for me, I think what I am honestly the most impressed by is the pivot. No one expected for COVID to come. No one expected that our work would be halted and we wouldn't be able to go into the prisons anymore. And through many, many conversations, the pivots of and the people that we have curated to have these various conversations have been so educational. And I know for me, someone who is much younger and really just getting my footing into doing this work, specifically within prison, having a knowledge base that I can go to and refer to, and also place something that I can refer my peers to, I think is going to be super impactful. And honestly, life-changing and changing within the field. I feel very blessed at the end of this. It's been a long, long journey and very tiring to say for everyone. We've all had our own level of personal grief that has come along with 2020. But I'm just honestly in a state of gratitude right now. And I'm really, really thankful for everyone that has kind of participated in coming every week to the sessions, and those that have, given their knowledge, because without you all, we wouldn't we wouldn't be able to do this. And so for those that have been here every single week, listening to every single session, we're just super grateful. I know I'm super grateful because now, I can go back in 2025 and, come back to a session that I experienced now and use that as a continual point of reference. So I just want to say thank you to all, and thank you to Phil today and to Tom, because your talk was just very enlightening, and yeah, I just have an immense amount of gratitude. So thank you.
Thanks, Precious. It was, I mean, the way the sausage was made this year was just unbelievable. I mean, there's always unknowns as you're going into conference planning or production planning. This is what we do as theater makers, right? But the pivots of this last year have just been enormous. And I'm so thankful to Precious. I'm so thankful to Kurt. I'm so thankful to Karen, Ann, and Freedom, who can't be here right now, and Melinda, for being that glue that held us together through all that tight pivoting when we thought, how are we going to do this? How are we going to be able to bring this together from a 4-day in-person conference that was supposed to happen at the end of October to a 5-month enormous project that it's become. And I think Aaron Ann's coming back in. I think for me, what this year has given me is so much enrichment and enlightenment in terms of how I'm looking at different issues, how I'm approaching different populations with my teaching, how I am centering and foregrounding the idea of harm reduction, both within my classroom, in the structure of the lessons, in the structure of the organizations that I manage. It's been one of the most enriching years of my life. And as Precious said, we can always come back to this now. This is something that almost all of you have been involved in almost in a direct way. And I want to thank each and every one of you who have come week in and week out and been a part of this conversation. And I hope that your journey has been somewhat similar to mine. Because it really has just been astonishing. And to end this with Phil today was just beyond expectation. So thank you so much for that. And I also really, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank the Mcgill family and the Ryan family for their support, not just of this conference, because if it wasn't for those two families, there wouldn't have been a conference, because funding everywhere else dried up. All the fundraising that we had done for this conference at Notre Dame. And those two families came through and made sure that we were able to do this, and that we also were able to keep on going. So this may be the end of this conference as we see it, but as Kurt said, this is the beginning of different. This is the beginning of us being able to have a common family room, for us to come together, for people to reach out and say, hey, we should have a conversation about this. And we can make that happen pretty easily now and record it and distribute it to the world. So please, if anyone has ideas about how we move forward that way, anyone wants to be part of the organizing planning committee as we look to 2023 now for SiPC4, please get in touch that way because the planning starts now. And I don't think that we're going to take much of a rest in the meantime. We will, however, this is not quite the end of this conference. We're gonna wait about a month, and we're gonna create a highlight reel of all of these sessions, all of these moments, come together with a few other surprises that I'm not gonna say right now, in about a month, to just celebrate and to really dig in terms of a post-mortem, like what could we have done better? Where could we not have done better? And just hearing your voices and your reflections as well. And I think I'll close that right there, but I also want to open the space up to anyone else that feels compelled to say something right now, that would like to comment. But I love you and thank you.
Oh, Scott, thank you. I just want to say also thank you to everybody, just because I'm sorry I had a work thing and had to jump off and then jump back on. So, but just want to say what a pleasure it has actually been to be part of this community, and it continues to be. And then also just, the community of this planning committee, where we kind of went down the rabbit hole together in trying to figure out what to do and how to sustain something like this, and to create space and try to lift up this community during such a crazy time where so much was being asked of us, that is the thing that we're not usually prepared to do, which is just to sit and wait. There's a lot of sitting and waiting in this last year. And so we thought, well, we can wait and do some things together and learn some things together and get to know each other, get to know our work, get to know what are the things that we can share and learn, and the ways that we can grow. And so much is being asked of us this year. So I just want to say, thank you all for, joining us and just entrusting us with your time. Time is so precious right now, and it's always precious, but especially it feels like. So the fact that, week after week, so many people have chosen to be on this journey with us is really incredible. And I don't know very many other things that have been happening, during this time that have sustained in this way. And so my applause really goes to all of you, and my thanks and my gratefulness to, again, just be welcomed in this community. And I'm really looking forward to, how we're able to grow and expand what this looks like, and who's curating this work and who's contributing to this work. And I'm excited to see this room get bigger, but at the same time get smaller, because we know each other, right? So I'm super excited.